The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
All right, good evening. We are back with another episode of the Duke's Court. I'm Dave, the Bayonne Bleeder Finoli. I'm here tonight with co-host Chris, the Animal Fletcher, and Gary, the Mongoose Kinn. Gentlemen, how are you?
I'm ready to go 12, Dave. Ready to go 12.
Bayonne Bleeder. Very good, Dave. Very good.
There you go.
I have a funny line about Mr. Wepner at the end, which if we talk about the boxing would be hysterical for a lot of people. So
all right.
I have a funny line I can add to that. So.
All right. Well, tonight I have the pleasure to announce a new project we're going to work on. We put together an all-star cast of local writers and historians to tell the tale of Pittsburgh's saddest sports stories and games. We call the book Unlucky 21. The writers of the various chapters include the three of us, plus pirate historian extraordinaire Bill the Catfish Rainier, Tom Rooney, the former president of the Pittsburgh Penguins, who now runs the Rooney Sports and Entertainment Group. We have the man who gave me my start at the Duquesne Duke so many years ago in the sports department, the president now of JFL Resources and the former director of publications and special projects for the Pirates, Jim Lachima, the sports anchor for KDK TV, and in my mind, the most knowledgeable talk show host on the air on 93.7 The Fan, Josh Taylor, a phenomenal writer who I've known for years. He works for the Pittsburgh Catholic by the name of John Franco. Sean Gibson, who is the great-grandson of the legendary Josh Gibson, and he is the executive director of the Josh Gibson Foundation. He's going to help tell the tale of the end of his great-grandfather's storied career. One of the premier lawyers in the area, Sam Rich, who is retired and was active in the Pittsburgh drug trials. Right now he lives in Florida, in Bradenton, so he gets first-hand account of the young players playing for the Bradenton Marauders, but he'll be telling the story of the Pittsburgh drug trials. David Ciccatello, who is one of the most interesting baseball historians I've had the pleasure to talk to. Right now, he is the editor for a series of books on great classic ballparks that McFarland Books produces, including one of the great ones I've ever seen on Forbes Field. David's also a Pirate fan, and he's going to tackle the heartbreaking death of Bob Moose. Last and in no way least is one of the foremost historians and authors in this country on baseball, especially the first half of the 20th century, where he's written several great books on that I've enjoyed. Ronald Waldo. Ronald has made a career of writing of the Pirates and baseball in general in that time, but what I found out is he's also a very noted Penguin historian, and he's going to take on one of the most difficult tasks a Penguin fan can and tell the story of a Penguin team in 1975 that joined the record books in a bad way of dropping 4 straight games after taking a 3-0 lead against the Islanders. But I'll tell you what, this is a dream team of Pittsburgh historians and authors. Working with this group is the biggest honor I've had in my writing career. And I'm also proud to announce that the proceeds of this book will be going to the Josh Gibson Foundation. They do a lot of wonderful things with children in the inner city. Working on a great project I'm looking forward to that's supposed to open this summer in Station Square on the south side of Pittsburgh. It's called Heritage Park, and it's going to celebrate the rich history of the Negro Leagues in this area. And just seeing the plans on the website is just something to get fired up about. But having the sad stories certainly is every bit as much the landscape of the story of sports in Western Pennsylvania as the great championships we've all witnessed. And one of the chapters I'll be working on is about what I consider the greatest coach in the history of this area. I mean, say what you want about Chuck Noll. Jock Sutherland not only was a man who won 111-12 in his seasons at the University of Pittsburgh, winning 5 national championships before, unfortunately, the powers that be at the university began to be embarrassed at the calls of professionalism of paying the players and kind of forced the greatest coach they've ever had out of the university. Eventually, after a couple of years in Brooklyn in the NFL, he goes into the Navy in World War II, and he resurfaces as coach of the Steelers. So this guy who not only took Pitt to unparalleled heights that they never have come close to since, takes what had been a bad franchise at the time. They were coming out of World War II, had a little bump when they combined with the Philadelphia Eagles to form the Steagles, and then combined with the Chicago Cardinals to become what is considered the worst team in NFL history, and their nickname aptly was called the Carpets. So in 1946, after the war, they hire Sutherland. He takes them to 500 the first year. The next year, he brings them up to an 8-4 season. They looked like they were going to win the East and go to the NFL championship. Had a little bump at the end, and then, but this, not the 1972 Immaculate Reception, but this is the first postseason playoff game in Steeler history in 1947 that Sutherland took this group that certainly wasn't among the most talented in the league, but he took them to that level. Had a little team mutiny the week before because they weren't going to get paid for the extra game, which historians seem to think had an effect in their 21-0 loss to the Eagles. But nonetheless, there was finally enthusiasm about this team. In my mind, it was only going to be a matter of years before they won an NFL championship, which certainly would have negated the Steeler teams of the mid-1970s becoming the first champions the Steelers had. Unfortunately, in the off season, he's found wandering in the South. They find him, they bring him back. They goes in for an operation to find out what's going on. They discover he has a brain tumor, and he unfortunately dies days later after the operation. And the story of the chapter is really going to be about not only the success this man had and his unfortunate tragic death, but what I feel brought a Steeler team that was looking for championships and ended up not going back to the playoffs for 25 years. So with his death, so took the hopes of the success of that franchise. Now, Fletch, Unlucky 21 is the name of the book, and you're going to write a chapter that explains why 21 is unlucky in Pittsburgh.
Well, let's just say, Dave and Gary, that the Steelers, they've only retired 2 numbers so far. They've retired Ernie Stautner's and Joe Green's. I think they should retire the number 21, and I think they should do it as a preemptive. Because of the other franchises, number 21 has not been good. Not that they haven't been great players. They've been great players, but they've been tragic. Of course, we had the Roberto Clemente who wore 21 for the Pirates. He died trying to help folks in Nicaragua after that horrendous earthquake that was there in 1972. And then we had Michel Briere for the Penguins as a phenom. They compared him to, some people compare him to Phil Esposito, others to Bobby Clark. He scored the first overtime playoff goal in Penguins history. He led them to their first playoff series win. They beat the California Golden Seals that year. I guess they were the Oakland Seals at that time. Then in the off season, he and his girlfriend are in a horrendous car crash. He has traumatic brain injury, and he's dead within the year from that. But the other one that people don't think about a lot is Archie Vaughn. And you may be asking yourself, who is Archie Vaughn? And that's really kind of the life of Archie Vaughn. He's probably the second greatest shortstop in Pirates history. He does hold the record for the highest batting average in a single season. He had 385 in 1935, I believe it was. He was the MVP that year. He would have hit 400, but at the late end part of the season, he went in a 4 for 27 slump and it brought his average down. But he's always overshadowed. And, he retires from baseball, and 33 years later, even though he has a Hall of Fame credentials, he's a quiet player, a little bit of a rabble-rouser, though, in some ways with management. And for 33 years, he's held out of the Hall. And finally, he gets inducted in 1985. And what happens that, the league, the Hall of Fame puts out a commemorative stamp and a commemorative envelope, and they spell his name wrong on it. Only Archie Vaughn could something like that happen to. So he was 40 years old when he died. He was on a fishing trip. He was with a guy who was a pretty big guy, decides he's going to stand up in the middle of the boat and cast, and capsizes the boat, and Archie Vaughn ends up drowning. And again, I mentioned being overshadowed. He was maybe the second greatest. He was the second greatest baseball player to come out of Fullerton, California. The only one who was better than him, Walter Johnson. And it was just, he was an incredible ball player. 2,100 hits. I think Bill James, Dave, you were telling me about this, had him ranked as the number 2 shortstop. Is that correct?
He did, absolutely, in the early part of the 21st century.
And he finally gets to the World Series in 1947. He's traded to the Dodgers. He ends up leaving the Dodgers because he gets in an argument with Leo DeRocher over how DeRocher was treating one of the pitchers. Out of baseball, they get him to come back after 3 years, becomes a utility man, plays for about, 30 or 40 games that year, finally gets to a World Series in 1947, and he goes 1 for 2. But the other time he gets overshadowed is he's a 9-time All-Star. He's playing in the All-Star game in 1941. He cracks 2 home runs in that game, but Ted Williams hits a 3-run homer to win the game, and no one talks about Archie Vaughn.
That's some incredible stuff, my friend. That should be an incredible chapter.
And the reason that he died is because his wife did not want to go fishing. Had she gone fishing with him, they would have been fishing from the shore. Instead, since she didn't go, they went out on a boat.
Oh man, that is incredible stuff. That is a great story. Looking forward to reading that. And Gary, you get to write about one of the most depressing moments in Penguin history. Why don't you talk a little about that?
I will, but 2 thoughts I have, Dave. That Jock Sutherland team, that Eagles team ended up winning the NFL title in '48 in the rain in Los Angeles. That was a very good Eagle team. Steve Van Buren's still a god here back in the East. I mean, I'm not sure he's alive anymore, but when he would appear at stuff when I first moved here years ago, he was well revered. That was a great Eagle team. And Fletch, I mean, you hit 385 one year as a shortstop before 1940. I mean, that's got to put you in the greatest shortstops ever. And I didn't know the Archie Vaughn story till I reconnected with you guys, but I looked it up, and it's I mean, it shouldn't have taken that long. I mean, there's a number. I mean, Joe Tinker and some other guys were good players in their era. They don't have anywhere near the numbers. Not that we make the decision on numbers. There's more to it than that. I think we all agree on that. But there's no doubt that Archie Vaughn, quite frankly, one of the best offensive shortstops of all time.
In his best 3-year period, he hits 351. I mean, not many shortstops can make that.
And that was a heavy offensive era. We all know that. When they put when they juiced the ball in 1930 on, and some guys went to war, or some guys, whatever. The Depression didn't. You don't want to have a big star. You might not want to pay somebody who's a prospect, but nonetheless, that's just tremendous. That it is a sad story, but it's a fantastic story too. It's that's part of it. Well, let me get to what you asked me about, Dave. I mean, I think, I was thinking about this the other day. We have the heels of being a Pittsburgh Sports fan. In October 1992, we have one of the most crushing losses ever because we knew the organization would change with the Pirates.
Right.
So what do we get? We get the break of we got the best team in hockey in January and February, and particularly in March with, I think it was 18 straight victories. We got the best team in hockey. We think, okay, well, 2 different sports, but we still have this. And the Penguins were that Penguins team still, to me, even though they won 2 titles and lost this year that we're talking about. That Penguins team, top to bottom, the way the defense was constructed, the 4 forward lines, Barrazzo in the net, that is one of the all-time great hockey teams. And some of the game simulations companies out there, if you buy their games, that's one of the teams they give you the choice to choose to learn how to play the game. So that's another example of how good that team was. 56-21-7, as you said, Dave. We talked about hockey last week, playing 7-0-8 hockey. 367 goals against, or 367 goals for, only 268 goals against. They were second overall in goal scoring in the league, and they were third in least given up. I mean, what an amazing team. But that series against the Islanders, it started out the first game. The Islanders won the first game. They kind of dominated, played a little bit, surprised everybody. They thought, that's just a bump in the road. Pittsburgh did come back in the second game, shut them out. Okay, now it's time. It's going to take over. Game 3, Pittsburgh wins 3-1. Game 4, Islanders surprised everybody, scored 6 goals. The Penguins gave up a lot. They were defensively sloppy, not unlike what we saw this year. Tie series. A little more nervous. Penguins win Game 5. Okay, we're going to win it. Nope. Islanders score 7 goals in Game 6. Again, sloppy defense and foolish penalties. All of a sudden, now we go to a 7th game. Francis got kicked out. A guy like Ron Francis gets kicked out with a game misconduct in a Game 6. I don't remember exactly what the infraction was. I think it was probably a high sticking foul or something like that. It was kind of an omen. And then sure as hell, that Game 7, 3 names will be burned into my head forever. Glenn Healy, David Volek, Rich Pilon. I mean, all 3 of those guys had a major effect on the game for different reasons. Healy stood on his head the whole series. He made a ton of stops. He played well, better than that series than he did in his entire career. We all know what happened to Kevin Stevens when Rich Pilon, who wore a shield before anybody wore one, collided with him in that corner. I can still see it happening. I can still see Stevens on that ice, and they had to bring the stretcher out, and he was never the same after that physically, life-wise, or hockey-wise in particular. And David Volek's goal kind of reminded me a little bit when I think back of what happened with Ovechkin batting that goal in on the. He didn't bat it out of the air, but he was kind of unimpeded. He came down, he scored that goal, and I couldn't believe that one of the teams I thought was one of the best teams I ever saw, constructed with all those centers and all those good defensemen, the Samuelsons, everybody else, Larry Murphy, we lose. I mean, that was a tough time to be a Pittsburgh Sports fan. So, yeah, I am looking forward to dissecting that, going back to that, and looking at what happened. But it is one of the saddest moments ever because, quite frankly, they had a chance to win 3 straight. It clearly looked like they were going to do it. They were killing everybody in March, and they won the first-round series. The second round is the most dangerous series in the NHL playoffs every time. So I'm looking forward to writing about it, looking forward to contributing to the book this way.
And it certainly was, in my estimation, the greatest non-championship team of the 3 franchises. In fact, in my book, Greatest Teams, Pittsburgh's Greatest Teams, it was the only one in there from those 3 franchises that didn't win a championship. But it certainly goes down as probably the greatest, at least greatest regular season team we've ever seen in a Penguin uniform.
They had gotten the chance to mesh. I had seen them that season, late in the season. They came into Philadelphia, and I was working at an organization at the time. I had tickets that were close to the ice, and it was just they just had an air about them. You just kind of felt that now they've got some time together. They all kind of had their roles, and they pretty much accepted them, particularly during that winning streak. And it just was, I don't know, it felt impossible that they could lose, and particularly lose to a team that was, as you said in last week's discussion, Dave, a team that was basically 500. The Islanders were 3 games over 500. But they made a lot of defensive mistakes. It was somewhat similar to what we saw a week ago and the prior 2 weeks. I mean, there was just things that happened, thinking back about that series, which I hadn't done in a while, but thinking back about that series and clearly going to, write that in the book. There were things looking back at it, looking at the goal totals and stuff. That just was not that Penguin team. It was just one of those unfortunate circumstances. But 7 games isn't all that much of a sample. You make a few mistakes in a few games, the series could be over. So
it certainly happened, and it did there. And there are so many good stories in here. And while fans, as I said, obviously like talking about the winning. I mean, these stories are part of it too. These stories are things like 92 NLCS, the 72 NLCS. We all know where we were when Clemente passed away. They're every bit as part of the fabric of Pittsburgh sports as the winning. And I'm so excited for this project. And we should be ready to be on the shelves in September, mid-September for this. And it's just something I'm really excited about. So we'll talk a little more about it as the weeks go on, as we get a little closer, and we'll certainly have some of our esteemed colleagues coming on to talk a little about their ends of it. But we're excited to be doing this. Now, as far as what we're going to talk about this week, the first subject wasn't something that originally was on the docket, but when the Supreme Court came out the other day and basically struck a blow for states being able to get into sports betting, sports gambling, to me, this changes the whole picture. This is huge. This is something that experts guesstimate can increase the value of franchises by almost double in the next few years. The excitement to be able down the road to go over in Pittsburgh, to go right next to home field at first, and make a bet on the Steelers before a Steeler game. Eventually, you're talking kiosks in sports bars. You're talking OTB setups for sports betting. I can even see down the road. I mean, the NBA and Major League Baseball are already working towards this, and working towards getting a portion of these proceeds in New Jersey, and I assume they'll be working on other states as it comes through. But you might be able to see kiosks down the road in an arena. So, I mean, the excitement it generates without betting, horse racing, nobody goes. So it generates that kind of excitement there. And I was reading an article today about what's expected at horse racing venues now with all sports betting coming in, which they're expecting to light up their sport again, which has fallen a little over the years with interest. But I just think this is something we can't even see the surface of what's about to happen with this, and certainly it'll be nice to be able to not sneak around and bet on our NCAA March Madness pools going forward. Unfortunately, I have a feeling when we do it on ESPN and CBS, we may be paying a little fee there, doing some money. But I just think, to me, this is one of the biggest things to come into sports in ages, and something that only the NCAA is seems to be afraid of right now. Gary, what are your thoughts? You certainly have been to Atlantic City on many occasions, the state that was fighting the Supreme Court for these rights. And how do you see this going forward?
Been to Las Vegas too, Dave, as well, for some of the fights and stuff. So I think as I look at this situation, I'm not as worried about it as far as it maybe having a potential down the road impact on the outcome of a lot of these sports, whether they're professional or college sports. I think that I think that making it easier to do it and kind of bringing it out more in the open, whether it's in, I hear you with the arenas and stuff. I think that'll be a little bit of ways. I think I can think of the NHL, which I know the best, and even Major League Baseball, who, we see kind of politically correct stuff with pink bats and blue bats and all the pink hats and all this kind of stuff. I kind of think they're going to be a little more cautious about getting it close to where they put their products on. But I don't think it's going to change things all that dramatically. It may certainly impact the value of franchises because obviously they're going to insist, if their logo is on something, they're going to insist on getting a piece of that, even if it's a nickel of a dollar. One. Two, I think that it's probably going to cause people who, just love the thrill of gambling or betting to pay a little bit more attention to things that they might not. Horse racing's always been heavily dependent upon betting, so is boxing, something I've paid a lot of attention to. I'm not so sure. Maybe hockey or NBA basketball is as wide scale as football may be. But I think now it's going to open it up to a lot more people, kind of put it out in the open, and it's legal, and you don't have any worries about it, and all of a sudden you start to see it crop up somewhere. And, the margins, they always joke when I would go to Atlantic City that the margins are huge in this business because, quite frankly, the payouts are small. And it's the same here. So I think that it will be very, very lucrative. I think it'll bring sports a little bit more into the limelight. Hard to believe that it already is, but I think it might. I think it might open it up to people that have a passion for that kind of thing or find a joy out of that. I mean, I think the worry that I have, though, is when you legalize something like this, sometimes it almost makes it a little bit easier to get away with something that's not on the up and up. And I don't mean necessarily the teams or the athletes making millions of dollars. even some college students. But, you know, in a business that's based upon collecting money and paying out a small amount of it and pocketing quite a bit if the operation is run well from any standpoint, you know, there is an incentive sometimes for people to kind of bend the rules to keep that going or to get a piece of somebody else's pie. I think in any case where you're desperate, you know, if you're running a professional sports organization and you know somebody's in pretty serious trouble for whatever reason it is, yeah, I just think it's going to put the pressure on professional sports organizations to monitor that. And I think we've already seen a lot of ugliness in the college basketball world. Football, not as much lately, of a different nature, but we've already seen some of the ugliness there, which maybe wasn't necessarily money-driven, but there's been a lot of noise circling around should athletes be paid. You know, these guys their coaches make $5 million a year in a shoe contract. They don't have enough to buy, you know, lunch when they go on the road. You know, there's a desperation there, and I think the one thing that I have been able to see up close, and any of us have if we've been to whether it's casinos or sports that are heavily casino-driven or even horse racing, is there's a lot of desperation sometimes with people that do this. It probably helps them get to further desperation. I don't mean just the bettors, but anybody involved in the games themselves. I just think it's going to involve a little bit extra scrutiny for the colleges and universities and for some of the professional sports organizations to make sure that it stays clean. But I don't think it's going to be anything that's going to cause major upset or all of a sudden we're going to have a bunch of – I don't think we're looking at a new Black Sox scandal because of it. I don't think we're looking at another college basketball point-shaving scandal because of it.
Yeah.
There's a lot of money to be made in all of these businesses now. You don't want to – people aren't always smart enough, and I've seen this in boxing especially, to not cut the goose that lays the golden egg. But by the same token, there's enough money to be made here that I don't really know how much more this is going to do. These are already billion-dollar businesses professionally, and quite frankly, major college football and basketball are already billion-dollar businesses themselves. So I think it just brings it out in the open. It makes it easier. I think it can help from a marketing and an attention standpoint. I just think that it's going to fall more on the organizations to be a little bit more diligent about what they're paying attention to. So I'm living here in New Jersey. I think some of New Jersey's move and push for it was more due to economic pain, suffering, financial mismanagement in the state, which quite frankly is getting worse. That's a longer story and not a sports discussion, but New Jersey as a state really should never be in the position it's in with its high property taxes, its cities which contribute nothing. It's located between Washington and New York. It should be a lot more fiscally sound than it is, and there's a million reasons why it isn't. They push for that because, quite frankly, our casino industry here has been hammered because we have a casino every 15 miles in the metropolitan area. So I think their need is for the revenue from it. Just like if you notice, New Jersey is the heaviest pusher of not even sports betting, but like all these internet sites where you can play blackjack. New Jersey is the biggest pusher of that because, quite frankly, gambling beyond agriculture and beyond tourism, the gambling industry is a huge industry in New Jersey. So that's a little bit self-serving. I don't think they're doing that for anything sports-related. They're doing that for their own coffers. And that's my view of it all. So.
Now, Fletcher, you're looking forward to being able to bet if Jordy Mercer can get above the 200 mark while hitting with the bases loaded.
Well, you know, it's funny that you should say that. I mean, that's really what it's going to be about. It's going to be about the opportunity to bet on the most arcane things while you're sitting in the stands. The real big play in this, guys, is going to be on the internet. I mean, already you've seen DraftKings. They're reaching out to their people saying, okay, this ruling came down. It's going to definitely affect how we are covering sports, and they're going to be getting involved in that big time. And the other part of it is, too, especially on the internet part of it, there's a lot of people who do a lot of sports betting on the internet, and there's always been that sort of shadiness about it. You know, are you going to get paid? Well, now, you know, one of the things Gary said a couple of times is it's out in the open. And that's going to be a big boon. And the other part of it, too, is you look at this, the American Gaming Association, and this number to me is just bewildering. They said that $150 billion is spent every year on sports gambling, and 97% of that is illegal. So can you imagine the money and also just the tax revenue that's going to come from this? So
that's
it's
why
really going.
New Jersey's pushed as hard as they did, Fletch. That's why I feel New Jersey's the leader in it. Yep.
Yeah, and it's going to really, you know, think about how fantasy football really changed the game. That people were now, when they were watching football, maybe they weren't rooting for the team anymore, but they were rooting for their players. Well, now we're going to see something along those lines here.
About that. That's what Red Zone was made for.
So it's going to be interesting. Gary, I agree with you about what the roots of it were. It's going to be a wait and see thing, but definitely you're going to be able to do a lot of things on the internet. That's going to be the big play here.
Yeah, that's a great point. Absolutely a great point. And I mean, I'm kind of looking forward to it a little bit. I mean, I'm no way, shape, and form a big gambler, and I don't intend to put a lot of money into it. But I think that can be kind of a fun thing, walking into a game and you know, being able to take a certain angle on something, go on your phone, and you know, hope to win, as Myron used to say, a few shekels.
We would bet with each other about a series, Dave, or whatever. We would play bet with each other as long as you have some discipline and it's easy and it's not something that's gonna, you know, it's not something that you have an issue with as far as your own discipline. I don't really see it. I mean, people are doing it all the time anyway, and Fletcher, your numbers are staggering. I mean, if that's the case, that's staggering, and you can see why. $97 billion would be a bigger industry than hundreds and hundreds of American industries. So you can see why the legalization of that, people want to grab that dough. And I think your point is right on about the DraftKings. I mean, that's kind of what that's why New York would never, I think they probably were looking for some reward to come to them in New York. New York's similar to New Jersey. In the East, it's interesting. The political environment is blatant about, well, if I'm going to allow you to do this, you got to give me something, and it's because of mismanagement fiscally. But that's why New York would not authorize the DraftKings activity and stuff. But you're right, that's the individual player, but it's basically the same thing to me. And I'm in concurrence with both of you guys.
And Dave, whenever you go bust, you're welcome. I've got room in my sports room. I got a couch here. You'll be fine.
Well, I'm looking for that, and you know, when you know, I'm certainly betting on whether Rodriguez can hit over 140 and losing every day. I may need to take you up on that. I hope the tap is full.
Oh, it's steps away from the beer tap, so that's also a good thing.
Well, I think that's great. But, I mean, one point you made, I mean, the money that's going to go into the state, they guesstimate Pennsylvania, who, you know, I mean, we all know if there's a way to screw up something, our state is going to figure it out. But they guesstimate $74 million in revenues just on sports betting, which is, you know, I mean, it's a nice little over-the-top money coming into the state that, you know what, people are betting anyway, except it's going across the seas. It's, you know, why not get a little cut for yourself? But I look forward to it. I think it's going to be fun. I think we, as long as you do it in with discipline, as you mentioned, and I don't think it in any way, shape, and form. There's not going to be cheating. I mean, guys making millions of dollars a year to play baseball, they see what happens to Pete Rose. I mean, that's a lesson that for what a gambler could pay them is going to be nowhere near what Major League Baseball is paying them, for an example. But, you know, college sports are always, especially basketball, as you mentioned, Gary, it's always going to be susceptible for it. And it has nothing to do with the fact of if it's legal in Pennsylvania or not. I mean, gamblers have always been there, and the NCAA, I think half of what they're afraid of is now here's another revenue source for them. How are they going to continue to justify, you know, not letting these kids, if nothing else, not letting these kids get paid for autographs if they're stars, or get paid a certain percentage for selling their jerseys. I think that's where they're getting a little nervous at this point.
I mean, I think they're worried the NCAA has always been somewhat toothless, as we know, and it's a very difficult job. I mean, you're always in a conflict situation, whether, you know, North Carolina with filling out tests for people before they ever went to the campus is obscene, but North Carolina generates a ton of revenue no matter where they play. So you're always in a conundrum, but I think that I just think that the NCAA's had enough controversies as it is, whether it's the Louisville mess, the Arizona mess, the Kentucky mess. Like there's been a number of North Carolina. There's been a number of high-profile messes. Ironically, football seems to have fallen off the radar for that. But I just think that if I'm the NCAA, I just got to make sure that if I think I've got something fishy going on, I better be sitting down like you would in any other business with that university and say, what's going on here? I mean, this doesn't look too good. Like, what are you doing here? Like I just think they're going to have to be a little more. The teeth are going to have to be a little sharper because you're dealing with really young people who, a lot of them hate to say it, the big fancy car, the Reggie Bush problem, right? You gave them a big house, you give them a car, you probably get them access to a lot of, great entertaining people out in California, and what do you have? I mean, this could kind of bleed the same way. I don't think I'm as worried about professionally, but I am worried about the college sports world. I am, and I think that, unfortunately, college sports too, whether it's Michigan State or Penn State or wherever your location is, they have a tendency to be able to think they can sweep stuff under the rug. This could fall into that realm too. That's my worry. That's my only worry about it. But the reality is, how many people are betting on college football anyway? I bet you, out in Las Vegas, I went out there one time. One of the casinos that I went to, the whole floor had a wall that was like probably 20 feet high of TVs with nothing but betting and lines. And you're right, Fletch. You could bet on everything. You could bet whether he was going to throw 3 passes this round. I mean, I'd never seen something like. I didn't even think about that. So I mean, it's been going on anyway. But sometimes when you put out in the open, the scrutiny can get weaker. And I think that if I'm running a university that's had an issue, I just think I'd be really careful about my association with this. That's all.
Imagine, Fletch, if we had this when Tino Sinceri was at Pitt, the amount of things we could bet on in any given game.
My. Or, think about back to the Maulers days. How many times will Glenn Carano get knocked out of the game?
Where Mike Rozier actually played. Right. Would Mike Rozier actually play that week? Right.
Oh, man.
So there's your random Mauler reference for the week. So we managed to get that one in.
You got one of those purple helmets.
Did he win any? Every week.
I've got a Mauler's jacket, Gary.
Purple helmet. Man. Remember the big, muscular arm on the logo? Remember all that?
It was a classic. It was a classic. Oh man! But you mentioned you mentioned North Carolina, and one of the greats to ever come out of North Carolina. We go back probably the great to come out of North Carolina is Michael Jordan. Now last week we started getting into a little as far as who is the greatest basketball player of all time. You have Michael Jeffrey Jordan, who has the nicknames as I'm looking here: Air Jordan, MJ, his airness, Money, Goat, and Superman. And the big thing is we rate him against LeBron James, who is called King James, LBJ, the Chosen One. One of my favorites, Bron, the Little Emperor, and the Akron Hammer. I've never heard that one before, but
never heard that one
either. But I just, to me, Michael Jordan, and you look at what LeBron, and again, trying to decide between the two of them, there is, it sounds like you're criticizing one over the other, but I mean, these are two just tremendous athletes, tremendous competitors, and tremendous winners. But in my mind, you have a guy who has led the league 9 times in scoring, has over a 30-point average for his career, which is phenomenal, in Michael Jordan. A guy who took teams with players like Bill Wennington and Luke Longley, and took a guy who never seemed to be anything more than a miserable teammate in Scottie Pippen. And to me, he took a little above average talent and turned it into one of the greatest franchises in professional sports history during his time period. A guy who had the will to win no matter certainly the flu game, certainly, when he's down and out about to force the 7th game against Utah. And I believe that actually was the flu game now that I'm thinking about it, but comes up with a shot out of his end. to win the title. LeBron, and we see this in the series now. LeBron is probably like a Lemieux versus Gretzky comparison, where LeBron is probably the better pure talented guy, but I don't know that he brings his teammates up with him as much as Michael Jordan. I don't know that the Bulls are the team they are if LeBron was leading the charge and Michael Jordan was. Again, these two guys are both tremendous winners, tremendous players, but if I've got to choose one, I don't think it's close. I think it's LeBron James, and I know you have other thoughts on this of some of your favorite Lakers out there, Fletch. So I'm going to let you bring a couple other guys into the mix here.
Well, I'm going to tell you who the most underrated, and this is going to sound crazy, but Kareem Abdul-Jabbar should be in that conversation. Played 20 years, 17 of them were amazing years. 3 were very good years, but yet he gets lost in this argument. Obviously I bleed yellow and purple, but the other people that you need to think about. I have LeBron at number 5 on my top 5. I got Jordan number 1. I have Kareem number 2. I have Magic number 3. I have Wilt number 4, and then I have LeBron.
Where do you put Russell in?
Russell was the ultimate team player because of his championships. I don't think he was as great a center as either Kareem or Wilt, but the man knew how to win, and I respect a lot. The other people in my top 10, I've got Oscar Robertson, we got Larry Bird, got Kobe, and the logo man who also gets left out. And Jerry West was an incredible player, defensively and also offensively. They made him the logo of the NBA, for God's sake. So yes, I'm bleeding a little Laker blood. He was the Harlem Killebrew. And the other person I'd like to get in that top 10, I figure out a way to get in, is Tim Duncan. To me, is the most sound player I've ever seen.
Absolutely. I would agree with you. And what he did in San Antonio, I know he had David Robinson. I know he had certainly other good players with him, but he was a guy who probably is along the lines of a Bill Russell, maybe not being an elite stat figures compared to some of the others, but, he just found a way to win.
Think about Oscar Robertson averaging a triple-double for an entire season. That's incredible.
He was that Milwaukee Buck team in 1971 is still one of my all-time favorite NBA champions. And you're right. Kareem probably, and I've had people get in my face about that before too, and they're right. Kareem does deserve a lot more in the argument than he's given. Now, I know, Gary, you like Larry Bird because you said he reminds you a lot of us trying to play basketball. Football's been in.
Exactly. Fletch, your top 10 is a great top 10, and as I thought about this, Dave, and we were preparing for this, what are you? I guess when you talk about the greatest, it's what are you judging it on? Are you judging on titles? Are you judging on longevity and perhaps statistics? Are you judging it on just kind of a soft, well, this guy did more with what he had to do than anybody else? Because that changes the list and juggles the list.
I look at Jordan as a guy who did it all.
He did. All those scoring.
Yeah.
I guess. Yeah. In basketball, for one reason or another, this probably speaks to me. There's always something I don't like about some of their all-time greats, and I don't know what it is or why I say that. It may just be me, but he kind of rubbed me the wrong way sometimes. But on the other hand, taking that away, taking out any feeling about that, it's really hard to argue with, as you say, Luke Longley, Bill Wennington, John Paxson. They were good athletes. But they weren't, like some of the collective, cohesive unit that, some of the Lakers or Celtics teams that we loved in the 80s, or even some of the Knicks teams and stuff. Like, they didn't have that top flight number 1 draft pick kind of thing. I think Jackson had a lot to do with this, and I think he kind of let Jordan kind of be the voice on the court and even off the court sometimes. But, I mean, it's hard to argue with all those scoring titles and all those titles in a row, in a good era. I mean, an era that's underrated. I mean, those Rockets teams were great teams in that era, and they won 2 in a row when Jordan decided just didn't want to do this anymore with his crazy trying to play baseball. But, I mean, those Rockets teams were damn good teams in any era with Olajuwon and Ori and all those guys, Mario Elie and Kenny Smith, who was a tremendous point guard. I mean, and, you had some other good teams there. You still had the Blazers, who were pretty good. You had the Pistons, who were kind of on the downside, but still pretty good. And for one reason or another, Jordan seemed to be able to get anybody to get in the system. Maybe he was a royal pain in the ass in the locker room. And you knew he was in charge, and you better listen to him. If he didn't, he would run you out like we see sometimes in the NBA. But you forgot to mention Rodman. I mean, nobody could rein Rodman in. Talie couldn't do it, and he went to the Bulls, and, he still did all his goofy stuff off the court and made a scene of himself. But when he was at the Bulls, he was a major contributor, and quite frankly, he was a little less disruptive.
So you look at that 72-10 team. Here's the roster: Randy Brown, Judd Buechler, Jason Coffey, James Edwards, Jack Haley, an older Ron Harper, Michael Jordan, Steve Kerr, Tony Kukoc, Luke Longley, Pippen, Rodman, as you mentioned, an older player by that point in time, 35 years old. An older John Sally, Dickie Simpkins, and Bill Wennington. I mean, you're not exactly talking about a power 3 team at that point.
It feels like if you take him off, that team doesn't even make the playoffs. That's right. That team had trouble to make the playoffs then. Right.
Yeah.
So, I mean,
guys, you know what today is the anniversary of, don't you?
What is it?
Perhaps the greatest finals game ever played by a rookie in the NBA. This was the day that after Kareem went down, the Magic Johnson stepped in to play center as a rookie, dropping 40 points on the Sixers to lead the Lakers to a championship.
I'll tell you what, I was in Hermione, PA that night, who held the record back then in 1980. What was it, 80 or 81?
It was 80.
That would be 80.
In 1980. Hermione held the record for having most bars per capita in the United States at that point in time. And I was in Hermione, laughing when I saw Magic start to play center, thinking, oh, God, the Lakers are going to get blown out this game. But they did not.
Malone wasn't yet with the Sixers, but they had Caldwell Jones. Dawkins, that was a very good Sixer team. I mean, Magic has to be in any discussion of the best players ever. If you like Jordan's winning, Magic has to be in that too, because he came into the league and he immediately. I mean, I think Kareem to me has always been one of the most underrated players in history.
Yeah.
I mean, he wasn't a self-publicizer. He's a little bit of an odd personality, but he literally could do everything. He was a much better rebounder than people gave him credit for. He was a distractor. He was a pretty good free throw shooter for a big man. And honestly, some of his moves, that sky hook, it was never defensible by anybody. I mean, he has to be in there too. The Lakers have a number of those guys in there, Fletch, and I know you love the sound of that. I mean, my feeling about all this.
I'm sorry, Gary. Could you say that again? I didn't hear you.
What didn't you hear, Fletch?
Can you say that one more time?
The Lakers have a number of guys in the top 10 in NBA history, so there you go.
Oh, thank you.
They do, and honestly, I mean, they really do, regardless of any opinion. When you think about it, I mean, Magic at the guard position, and some of the things that he was able to do, the way he would dominate the game, the distributing the ball. He had a good supporting cast for a number of years. I mean, Nixon very underrated. Worthy, very underrated. Kareem, one of the best ever. But, Magic just, beyond his exuberance as a personality and all that stuff, I mean, he could beat you a lot. He made himself into a tremendous, kind of reminded me of Crosby a little bit in hockey. People said he couldn't shoot. Well, he was a pretty damn good shooter by the time his career ended. He could beat you with a three-point ball as much as he could beat you with down in the low block. He was a fierce warrior. When the game was harder, he was better. Kareem, very underrated. But, it's funny, Fletch, this is going to be, I guess, an ode to you. But when I think about the greatest player I'd have to say Jordan in terms of picking up his team, maybe leadership. There's no doubt James is one of the best athletes we've ever seen. And Dave, as you alluded to with that 07 team and this team, even if they go out here to the Celtics, which it looks like they might, to pick this up and to try to meld this group into something that was effective, and he has a triple-double again last night. I mean, the guy has to be in the group. Love him or hate him, he has to be in there with all the things. Even down in Miami, I mean, Wade's a great player. He's never won anything other than when he was with James. You know, Bosh was a good player. He couldn't do anything in Toronto before he got with James. That team didn't have a deep bench or a deep talent. I mean, he had Riley who knew how to put a team together, but I mean, even the stuff he accomplished down there, you know, whether they won the series or lost the series, he made the teams competitive. So James has to be in there. But you know, my brother, I was lucky. My brother was a very fine basketball player. He was a high school All-American. He was a college player. He had been around a lot of guys that are before the era we're talking about. Played against Bob Lanier, played against Pete Maravich. And, you know, my brother Tony is a very knowledgeable basketball guy. He said that Chamberlain, to him, regardless of the criticisms of Chamberlain, again, it comes down to what you want. Do you want winning, or do you want dominance, or do you want dominance in error? He said that watching Chamberlain, talking to guys that played against him, he said, you know, to him, Chamberlain is still, in some ways, the greatest player of all time. Everything they said Chamberlain could do or couldn't do, he proved it the other way. They said he couldn't pass the ball. He wasn't a team player. All he did was look for his own shot. He couldn't beat Bill Russell. Went to the Sixers. He had a better supporting cast. He led the league in assists. I think he led the league in scoring a number of times. I mean, I don't care if you're playing in the archaic era of basketball, Greek era. You average 50 points a game, professional basketball, and those athletes prior to expansion. I mean, how do you compare to that? I mean, there wasn't, and I did not see a lot of Chamberlain, so this is an odd thing for me to say. If you're asking for who I've seen, I'd probably have a tendency to go probably to Jordan just because of everything he accomplished. James in there, and Kareem. I agree with you guys. But, I mean, you look at Chamberlain's career and how long he lasted, too.
Yeah.
I mean, he was still an effective player at those Laker teams. He was in the late 30s against those teams, the Knicks, and some other teams in the early 70s. I mean, he was still a major factor. And then he went to the ABA. He was a player coach in the ABA for the San Diego Conquistadors, and quite frankly, he didn't play that much, but the games he was in, he was dominant. I mean, it's hard to argue that he is not the greatest player in NBA history when you look at it statistically. Now, he didn't have the best winning. I mean, clearly the Celtics could beat them. They beat them a number of times. They beat them. You know, he was eliminated by the Celtics. He was with the Philadelphia Warriors before he even got to the Lakers or the Sixers. But I mean, you look at what the man accomplished over a long period of time. To me, he has to have consideration in this discussion.
No, he certainly does. He was a freak. He was, I mean that in a positive way. He certainly was the first athletic big man, and you could say he was the Babe Ruth of basketball, putting up stats that nobody has seen before, and did it in a dominant way. I mean, I know you like him for other reasons, Fletch.
Yes, he was quite the record breaker. But you know, Gary, you mentioned it too. I mean, he went from being the best scorer to being the best pivot man. Which who makes that kind of transition? In the year that he's averaging 50 points a game, he's also averaging 25 rebounds a game. That's insane.
I mean, it's a different game. Those guys played a lot more minutes, and the benches weren't as deep, and they didn't have as much travel, quite frankly. But, you know, the one thing I think about is I remember as a kid with my dad and my brother watching the Lakers series against the Knicks and watching that Laker run where they win like 33 in a row or something.
33 in a row, yes.
Right. I mean, to watch Chamberlain how he adjusted. Now he was at the end of his career. He was still, you know, he was a better athlete probably when he was 60 than most people would be at 30. But you know, he got there with Baylor and West, as you say, and you know, even Gail Goodrich and guys that needed the ball. And again, he never got enough credit for adjusting his game. You know, he didn't. Now in those days, people didn't carp about I'm not getting the ball, I'm not the star, or whatever. But even though he was older and he realized it might be his last chance. Whatever you needed him to do, he could do it on those teams. And you know, they didn't win as many as people thought after they put that group together. They were a little bit up in years. I mean, Baylor and him and West were all more than 10-year veterans. But they still won a ton of games. They still dominated the league. They still got very far. And I think they won a title or two in that era. when they were together. So, I mean, it's kind of hard to say that, the guy didn't do anything you asked him to do, whatever the circumstances were. So, I mean, to me, that does not have the resume of winning that Jordan did. It wasn't getting the same attention either, which is something that's a factor here for all of us or anybody who thinks about basketball. And he certainly didn't do all the things. He was probably a bigger James. James is probably the best athlete maybe we've ever seen. He was probably a bigger James, but there isn't a situation where Chamberlain didn't adjust when he was criticized. He might have been a little too sensitive about it if you read some of the stuff that either he wrote himself or is out there, but he still did it. And I got to trust my brother's opinion. My brother, with the background he had and some of the people he played against in camps and stuff never got to play against Chamberlain. He is a Laker supporter, but by the same token, he's also objective. And he said, Russell may have been a better leader. That may have been a better cohesive unit. That may have been a better organization, quite frankly, than the Lakers were even. But that still doesn't mean that Chamberlain wasn't the greatest player in that era and quite frankly, for a very long time. So
the wild stat about Chamberlain, he was scoring all those points. Don't forget, his free throw percentage was horrid. He was not getting the benefit of drawing the foul and getting free throws. He shot 5-11 for his career. When he averaged 44 and 50 points a game, he wasn't even getting over 60% of his free throws.
Exactly.
So, I mean, that adds to the legend. If he was a decent free throw shooter, I mean, those stats would have been even more through the roof.
Hey, guys, as far as big men, the one thing I always think about when the big men is, you think back about sequences where they would do stuff, and both Chamberlain, at the end of his career, I remember seeing as a very young person. Kareem, more mature, growing, teenager, getting ready to, we all got together in college. And then watching Olajuwon in the 90s. Those three big men could turn sequences that would turn a game in a second. They could block a shot, get a tremendous rebound, make a great outlet pass, score. They could turn games, those three big men. And I don't know, I guess I just have an affinity for the big guy. I know the game has changed a great deal. It's more of a slasher game and stuff like that. I still think if you got a good big man like that who can do a lot of things, I think you're going to win a lot of games. And all three of those big men could change a game in an instant, in my view. So,
absolutely. We're going to go to one more subject here before we tie things up. One thing we were talking a little about last week was our favorite boxing matches over the years as we grew up in the 70s or 80s. I mean, mine certainly precious little compares with Matthew Saad Muhammad and Yaki Lopez. The second time those guys fought, light heavyweight title. Lopez was taking the fight to Saad Muhammad and just had a thorough lead. And in the 8th round, he takes 20 unanswered shots at Muhammad. You think the fight is over, and all of a sudden Muhammad wakes up. Starts knocking Yaki Lopez around a little bit, and then he certainly goes on to win in the 14th round. The other one I certainly remember is my own heavyweight title fight I saw at the Civic Arena in Pittsburgh when Larry Holmes and Ronaldo Snipes went at each other. Holmes expected to cruise to a fairly simple victory against an underdog fighter. And all of a sudden in the 7th round, while he's having a dominant victory, Snipes throws a punch that puts him down, and it wasn't just a flash knockdown. Holmes had no idea where he was. Holmes kind of stumbled as he tried to get up, and looked like all of a sudden, this undefeated great heavyweight champion was in the end of his career, and only to make a miraculous comeback and take out Snipes in the 11th round, and what was just a fabulous night of boxing. One where we got to see a young James Buster Douglas, who I did not realize I even saw, get knocked out by David Bay, a local Pittsburgh fighter. But those were just some incredible fights I saw back in the day. Gary, I know certainly have a lot more that you had seen there.
Well, I do. It's funny. We were together then. We were in school together, and I couldn't make that one. I would have gone to that, but I had to deal with some family matter. But yeah, you're right. I mean, Snipes. Other than when Tyson fought, or when Holmes fought Tyson, which was way at the end of Larry's career, Larry was never in trouble like that, and he showed a lot that night. He even in one of the fights I'm going to mention, he was in some trouble, but he wasn't in the trouble that Snipes put him in. And again, Larry's one of those guys, much like some of the things we're talking about in the other sports, never got enough credit. Larry Holmes was one of the greatest heavyweights ever. His era was not the deepest. There was a lot of stuff that went on in that era that was not good for the sport. But you're right, Dave. I saw the fight after the fact, but yeah, I can see why that would be memorable, in particular if you're live.
Hello.
I have a couple. I have about 50, but I'm going to just put a couple in there, and some of them might surprise people, but. You know, anybody who's listening to this who's a boxing fan should really get knowledgeable with YouTube, because YouTube is great for boxing history, actually, in my view. But a couple fights I have. One of them does involve Larry Holmes, Dave. Larry Holmes, Ken Norton, June 9th, 1978, Wide World of Sports. That still may be the best heavyweight fight that I have ever seen. That includes Ali, Frazier. That includes, Foreman, Frazier, Foreman Ali. Even some of the subsequent ones with Holyfield, Lennox Lewis, Riddick Bowe. That Larry Holmes, Ken Norton fight that night, or that afternoon rather, I think it was in Las Vegas in 1978, June, was one of the best heavyweight fights you'll ever see. People should Google that up. They'll have newfound respect for both of those guys. That fight had boxing fights. They're great. Have shifting tides. They have constantly shifting tides. Both guys have their moments, and something surprising happens. That all happened in that Larry Holmes, Ken Norton fight. Now, I think another one I'm going to pick is a little bit later, but on a snowy night in Atlantic City, unfortunately, I didn't get to see that one live, but Roberto Duran, Iran Barkley, February 1989. Roberto Duran was considered at the end of his career. People said he was too heavy. He wasn't taken seriously anymore. Barkley was too much of a mauler. He was going to roll right through him. Wrong. The fight had tons of shifting tides. Not that both guys hit the canvas, but there was tons of shifting tides in it. It was back and forth. Barkley was in a lot of trouble. Duran was in some trouble, but turned the fight. Duran showed how great he was, fighting a much bigger man, much later in his career than anybody would realize. Another one. If you haven't seen it, Google it up. I think you'll like boxing if you do. And I think the Leonard Hearns one, to me, in 1981, all the hype around that, all the hype around Leonard and his gold medals and his personality, his big smile, and Hearns kind of a dark guy and moving up from welterweight and moving up a little bit to fight Leonard, and it didn't have the same explosiveness of the famous Hagler-Hearns fight a few years later in Caesar's Palace in '83, I think it was. But people were talking about boxing in that fight that never talk about boxing, and they both had good marketing machines, both had good promoters, good trainers. But the fight itself was a fantastic fight. I mean, there's still Hearns to this day, much like plenty of fighters, are very angry about the stoppage in the 14th, and he has legitimate complaints. I mean, the fight was competitive. I mean, maybe it shouldn't have been stopped. And that's another thing. Controversy beyond shifting tides and beyond both guys having their moments in boxing and a surprising ending. The controversy of that makes that something that, we could be talking about this 100 years from now on a podcast like this, and we'll still be debating whether or not that fight should have been stopped. And quite frankly, Leonard was turning it, and Hearns started to fade a little bit. But on the other hand, he was certainly in the fight on the cards and from a competitive standpoint. So those would be the ones in the era that you mentioned, Dave, that I would pick.
All right. And Fletch?
Well, Gary, you took two of mine, so
I'm sorry.
But that's all right. That's all right. But you also mentioned the Hagler and Hearns fight. That to me was just some of the most brutal boxing I think I've ever seen, where you just got in the middle of the ring and just had at it each other. Amazing rounds, just unbelievably savage. And I was thinking a lot about Larry Holmes, and the Norton Holmes fight was actually one that I was going to talk about as well. And Larry Holmes just, it's unfortunate. He really is never given his due. I think it was part of it was the competition, as you said. Part of it was what had happened to him. I mean, think about the tragedy of him too. is, he starts out as a sparring partner for Ali, idolizes Ali, and he's the one who had that fight where he absolutely destroyed the champ at that point, and you could see it in his eye. So when you're watching that fight, he's looking at the ref saying, "Can we just stop this now?" I mean, it was a horrible thing to see, and it was awful for Larry Holmes to be in the ring that day and be part of that. And the Tyson fight, it was just, unfortunately, it was a Larry Holmes that was way past his prime. And there were a couple rounds that he made it exciting, but when Tyson clocked in and put him out, I mean, it was horrible to watch. It was just, you saw a great champion and it affected Tyson too. I mean, Tyson certainly was giving him the respect at that time, because Tyson, as you recall, he was a boxing historian, thanks to Customato. I mean, he was raised on that.
He was.
And I'm going to go back a little bit later. Dave, we were talking about this today, and the Tyson Douglas fight. I usually got all the big fights. I didn't get that one, and I was traveling, and I had to leave on a flight early the next day, and I picked up my Los Angeles Times, and I saw what had happened in that fight, and I just couldn't believe it. Then when I watched the rebroadcast, and when Customato dies and is out of Tyson's life, it is the most unprepared corner I've ever seen in my life. I mean, what did they put on his eye? Was that a condom? I still don't know what that was.
It looked like a condom. Yeah. And who in God's green earth is going to?
Where's your iron? They're putting a big condom on him. What's up with that?
That was one of the most embarrassing moments in sports.
They totally underestimated Douglas, who was really got far in the Olympic trials as a big man with a big jab. They just completely disrespect. In boxing, you can never make the mistake of not training for something. I mean, rarely. I mean, sometimes in the early mismatches, but it was just offensive. I mean, and honestly, I can't blame Tyson totally, but I mean, he has to take some responsibility for something. Not an educated guy, tough background. All of a sudden, he's in the bright lights. A lot of his mentors are gone, but he also ignored a lot of people that, even though Cuss was gone. I mean, he ignored Rooney, he ignored Bill Caton. I mean, he has to take some. I mean, that's, to me, Tyson, his career, I give him a B-, because even beyond that, this is another discussion later. We talk about boxing, but he had so many chances to kind of right the ship. The boxer's still in control. And Mike was also unprepared for that Tokyo night. It was just tragic. It really was. So Merchant said it.
The other fight I remember, Dave, and you and I were on the phone. We were watching it separately. We were talking through it. It was the Riddick-Bowe Galata fight, where it was just mayhem after the fight, and somebody got hit by a clipboard, as I recall, and then Lou Duva, I don't know whether he has a heart attack or something, that they're carrying him out on a stretcher and they drop him. It was like the most bizarre thing I had ever seen. Wow. And I just remember yelling, "Down goes Duva! Down goes Duva!"
It was a Tyson situation. Bowe completely disrespected Galata before the fight. He gave him no credit, came in unprepared, and if you remember Bowe's faces in round 2 or 3, he was like, "Oh my God, what is going on here?" I mean, Galata was a big man who Duva was right about. Duva was a hard personality some people to take, but he said, Andrew's one of those guys who could play any sport. He could be a tight end in the NFL. He could play basketball. And Galata was a tremendous athlete. He had a dime head. He couldn't deal with any adversity, but I mean, Bowe and Tyson would be a good discussion unto themselves. So,
there's also the case of the glass groin for that fight too. I think too. Besides the
I mean, I think it's a shame. Galata. The most amazing thing about boxing is history. How often it repeats it. Galata did the very same thing 6 months later in Atlantic City when he was winning the fight going away, and he did the exact same thing.
Oh, that's right. I forgot about that.
So
he was a one kid. No ifs, ands, or buts. But we got Tyson's up now.
Badly in 2002, guys. Galata was beating Tyson badly in 2002. In his corner, Al Bonani basically said, "Look, get out there. I'm going to jam this mouthpiece someplace you don't want. You're beating the guy," and he quit.
Yeah.
I mean,
I remember that.
He was a tragic figure unto himself, Dave. So.
Well, we're going to tie things up now. It sounds like somebody has their show coming up. So we'll talk more about, I think, boxing. Boxers of the 70s or 80s are going to be on the table next week to talk about. And we'll talk a little bit more about Larry Holmes, who I agree with Fletch is certainly very underrated in the history of the game. Is it the contenders he had to fight that caused that? Most likely. But I will leave us with this fact. In 2000, former heavyweight champions Larry Holmes and Mike Weaver fought each other at a combined age of 100 years old. Holmes 51 and Weaver 49. So we will leave it at that, and we will come back next week and talk a little more. Outstanding show tonight, gentlemen.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks, Fletch.
Dave, Gary,
All right.
talk to you next week, fellas.
You got it, guys. Bye.
Good night.